So in this video, we're going to deal with some basic but very important aspects of dealing with categorical reasoning, and in particular with categorical syllogisms. The first of these involves translating propositions from ordinary language into a standard form, and then ultimately understanding the standard form of a categorical syllogism. So to connect this back to the class and to the textbook, we are basically covering Chapter 4, Section 4.7, which deals with translation, and then Chapter 5, Section 5.1, which deals with the standard form of a categorical syllogism. So let's start with Section 4.7, because this deals not only with categorical syllogisms, but with categorical propositions in general, and it's going to be perhaps the most difficult and important part of this entire section of the course. So the problem we're dealing with here is translating our statements from ordinary language, the kind of language we use in writing and everyday speech, to get it into a standard form. Because this actually is really important in order to be able to articulate clearly, either in an immediate inference what's being argued, or in a categorical syllogism what's being argued. And the problem we face, of course, is that we rarely speak or write in standard form at all. In fact, ordinary language is not overly conducive to putting things into standard form. And so what we're going to have to do is look at basic rules and ideas behind the whole process of translating. And for my money, frankly, I think this is really the hardest part about what we're dealing with. Once you have an argument laid out in standard form and you've moved from ordinary language to get it into just its formal components, it turns out this stuff's actually fairly simple. It's just running through a process. But much of the confusion here actually just stems from the fact that ordinary language is ambiguous and often confusing. So let's look at some examples of what I mean here. What's given to you on this page is essentially a list of different categorical propositions. The problem is that at first glance, these don't seem like they're categorical propositions, and they're certainly not given to you in the standard form that we've been working with, the all are, no are, some are not. If you look at something like libertarians rarely win elections, or I like to go to movies, it's not given to you with a clear subject-predicate form. There is no obvious quantifier and so on. So the challenge here is, how do we take stuff like this that we actually say, they actually write and so on, all of our ordinary propositions, and then how do we convert them into a standard form proposition? So the first thing to keep in mind as we start dealing with translations is to remember that categorical propositions only show up in 4 different sorts. If you have a categorical proposition, no matter how messy or complex it may be in ordinary language, in the end it must fit one of these 4 forms. We have our universal affirmatives, universal negatives, particular affirmatives, and particular negatives. All S's are P's, no S's are P's, some S's are P's, and some S's are not P's. And again, no matter how complex or messy it might be in ordinary language, in the end, if it's a categorical proposition, it must be able to fit one of these 4 possible forms. So the thing to keep in mind as we go through translations is that what you want every time by the time you're finished translating are these 4 pieces of a categorical proposition, and in this particular order. I need a clear quantifier, which means every single categorical proposition that you have will begin with all, no, or some. I need a subject term, which has to be a noun, essentially. It has to be a class or category of its own. I need the copula, which is simply the verb to be, usually are. And then we get the predicate term, which is also going to be simply a class or category of things. So the goal here when you start translating is to figure out, how can I get this statement to have these 4 pieces in order and still remain true to the original meaning of the statement. I need a quantifier, a subject term, a copula, and a predicate term every time without fail. So the easiest way to start down the path of figuring this stuff out is to just go through examples. And what we'll do as we start wading through examples is start with easy stuff, and then we'll get more and more messy and complex as we wade through the end here. So let's begin with propositions in ordinary language where we don't have clear nouns given to us. So take the statement, some coffee is bitter. Now this is pretty close to being in a standard form of a categorical proposition. If you take a look at it, we have a clear quantifier. It's some, and it's pretty clear it's a some are, right? So we have a particular affirmative in this case. It's also pretty clear that our subject term is simply the class or category of things known as coffee. The big question here is, what exactly is the predicate term? So if we stop and think about it, bitter is not a class or category of things. Rather, it's an adjective to explain or define a class or category of things. And so in order to get this into proper form, what we need to do is define clearly what that predicate term is. So when we're finished, we're going to end up with something like this. Some coffees are bitter beverages. Or frankly, you could put other things in there, bitter liquids, bitter drinks, bitter coffees. Doesn't much matter at this point. What you'll find basically is that when you get into a categorical syllogism or even an immediate inference, in many instances, precisely how you want to define the ambiguous terms will be determined by other statements in the arguments because your terms will repeat themselves. So you can start looking around in the argument to see precisely how you want to define it. But in the end, something like this is now a fully standard form proposition in categorical reasoning. Why? Because I have in order a quantifier, a subject term that is a class or category of its own. I have my copula, which is just the verb to be, and then I have a predicate term, which now, unlike before, is in fact a class or category of things. So what about cases where the verb is non-standard? Now notice when we talk about the verb being non-standard, what we're talking about here is the copula, because our copula is really just the verb to be, and it has to be there in every case. So sometimes when we assert ourselves in categorical terms, we're not going to use our copula, and we have to figure out how we can translate back. So let's take this example. Some wines must be decanted. Now again, notice we have a clear quantifier, some, and it's clearly going to be some are, so we have a particular affirmative. We also have a clear subject term. The subject is wines. But of course, what has to come next is our copula, and that just has to be are. So what we need is some wines are, and then we have to sort out the rest to make sure that our predicate term, in this case, is in fact a class or category of things. So notice, converted or translated into standard form, some wines must be decanted would look something like some wines are wines that must be decanted. And notice what this does for us is I have my clear quantifier. This is a particular affirmative claim. I have a subject class, wines, and then my copula that was missing before has now been inserted in there. Some are. And of course, we just have to sort out what comes next, and our predicate term now is wines that must be decanted. How about some birds fly? Notice we have essentially the same basic problem. Again, we have a quantifier that is some are. We have birds as a class or category for a subject, but we don't have the copula, the verb to be, and so we need to find a way to stick that in there and sort it out accordingly. So properly translated, this would look something like some birds are animals that fly, or birds that fly, or whatever. But notice what I need is that copula, the verb to be, has to be in there every time. I want these four pieces: quantifier, subject term, copula, predicate term. And in this case, I need to take the must fly and turn it into are things that fly, animals that fly, and so on, so that my predicate term is itself a full class or category of things, a noun. So those are the easier versions of this. And again, if you just keep in mind what your goal is to get these four pieces in order every time, quantifier, subject term, copula, predicate term, it tends to be a bit easier. Here's where things start to get a little more complex. In many instances, what we find is that what we're trying to deal with is a single thing or object out there in the world. Singular propositions of this sort are the kind where I want to say this particular cup or this particular table is what I'm talking about. And the problem, of course, is if I'm pointing at a very specific table and I say this table is, let's say, red or something, notice the quantifier is not so obvious at first glance, because I can't say all tables for the simple reason that I don't mean every single table in existence. I mean just this one. And I can't really say some because it doesn't refer specifically to that one singular object out there. So when you find yourself in a situation where you want to refer to a very distinct or singular thing, there is a sort of weird strategy we use in logic to sort out the translation into a proper translation. So basically, propositions about a single person, thing, event, place, or time are going to be translated into universal claims. There's the first point. So it has to be all or no. And then we'll use what is called a parameter. And a parameter is simply a phrase stuck in front of the object you're talking about that is identical to something like persons identical to, places identical to, things identical to, cases identical to, and so on. So notice if we go back to the example I just gave you, if I say this table is brown, what I want to say is all things identical to this table. And notice what this does is it takes that individual single table out there and it creates a class or category by itself by simply sticking this parameter in front of it. Things identical to this table, and then notice it has to be universal because there's only one of them, and I mean every last one of it. So notice, taking something like this table is brown, I would have to translate this into all things identical to this table are things that are brown. So let's look at some examples here. If I take the example, Bob went to school. Notice I don't have a clear quantifier here. I want to talk about this very distinct individual person, Bob. And of course, notice the problem is I can't say all Bobs and I can't say some Bobs because I don't mean just any old random one Bob. I mean this very specific person, Bob, that I'm talking about. So what do I have to do? Again, the first step is to make it a universal claim. So I'm talking about every conceivable Bob, but I mean only this one of them, since there's only one of them. And of course, what this translates into then is this. What we get then is something like all persons identical to Bob are persons who went to school. Now notice this translation gives us everything we need. We have a clear quantifier, we have a subject term, we have a copula, and we have our predicate term in the proper order. And of course, notice when I say persons identical to Bob, what I'm doing is removing that one person, Bob, from other contexts and saying there's just one of him. And of course, what I mean then is all of that one person's are. Now, this sounds rather stupid. It's quite unwieldy. And frankly, this is not a strategy that you should bring into your poetry classes or the like. But what it does do for us is very clearly identify, both in terms of the quantity and quality and in terms of the subject that we're talking about, exactly what we mean. So what we know now is that we have Bob, and Bob is a person who fits into the class or category of persons who went to school. And of course, not everyone who went to school is Bob, but Bob is one of those things that did go to school. How about the example of I like to go to movies? Now notice once again we have the same basic problem. What you're talking about is just yourself in this case, the one and only you. And of course, we can't say all me's, that just sounds weird if nothing else, and we can't say some me's. Instead, what I want to say is all persons identical to me. And notice what I do is I take myself and I create a class or category of its own out of me. So a proper translation would look something like this. All persons identical to me as my subject term are persons who like to go to movies. And again, keep in mind the basic strategy here. We're not doing anything different than the earlier examples. I just want to come up with a clear quantifier that is quantifying the subject, that is answering the question, how many and what kind of the subject are we talking about? I need my copula, the verb to be, which is basically what puts together the subject and predicate term. And then I need a clear predicate term. And in this case, I know that I, as a class unto myself, every last one of me, is the kind of thing that fits into the class or category of persons who like to go to movies. So let's take one last example. Gonzaga's library is a great place to study. Now notice in this case, it's pretty much like the other ones. We have this problem of singular propositions, but we're going to have to use a slightly different parameter to make sense of it. Now the first step, of course, is to make this universal, because we're talking about the one and only Gonzaga library, right? So it is a singular proposition, and I want to say every last one of it. So what happens basically in the translation is something like this. All places identical to GU's library are places that are great for studying. And again, this parameter is unwieldy. It sounds kind of silly, but in the end, what it does for us is it takes that subject term, this singular object or thing out there, and it creates a class or category for it all by itself. And then, of course, my quantifier has to be universal, whether it's affirmative or negative, doesn't matter. What that does basically is say every last one of this singular things are places that are great for studying in this case. And then what I want is that quantifier, subject term, copula, predicate term in that order every time without fail. How about pronouns as our quantifier? Now this is a bit more confusing in a way, but the basic idea here is if I have a pronoun, and this is very important, when it acts as a quantifier, there's a pretty straightforward rule that we have to use to translate. Propositions that contain pronouns as the quantifier, and of course it's important that it is in fact the quantifier. So it's quantifying our subject. It's answering the question, how many of the subject and what kind of relationship does the subject have to the predicate? But propositions which contain a pronoun as the quantifier are generally translated into claims about people or things. And what this means is that your subject term will refer to persons or things. The kind of phrases we're talking about are things like who, whoever, anyone, whatever, anything, that, and so on. When these things are acting as the quantifier of your subject term, notice what happens is we're going to get essentially some sort of quantifier, all, no, some are not, and then the subject term will refer to persons or things. So if I take as an example, whoever works hard will succeed, notice whoever is doing the quantifying, and the subject that it's quantifying is persons that work hard. So a proper translation of this would end up being something like, all persons who work hard are persons who will succeed. And notice that the subject term now is going to be one that refers to persons as the primary aspect of the class or category of things we're talking about. Another example from Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche says, whatever is done for love always occurs beyond good and evil. Now notice the claim here, whatever is done for love, is in fact quantifying things that are done for love. So if we wanted to translate this, that whatever as a pronoun acting as a quantifier has to be translated into all, no, some are not. And then of course, what it's quantifying will have to be persons or things. And in this case, pretty clearly it has to be things. So notice a proper translation of this statement would be all things done for love are things that occur beyond good and evil. Now we can also have adverbs that act as quantifiers. And this is going to follow a rule that's very similar to what we saw with pronouns. But we'll see we're going to have to convert our subject term into something a little bit different. So propositions which contain adverbs as quantifiers. Now again, it's very important that the adverb is acting as your quantifier, that it's quantifying your subject, or it is telling you or trying to answer the question, what kind of relationship does the subject have to the predicate? Propositions that contain adverbs as quantifiers assert spatial or temporal relationships. And so these will translate generally into claims about space and time, or the subject will refer to times and places. So what kind of phrases are we talking about? Well, things like wherever, anywhere, always, never, whenever, and so on, when these kind of claims are acting as the quantifier of your categorical proposition. So let's take an example. Anywhere you have extreme poverty, you will see an increase in crime. Now notice the anywhere is in fact quantifying our subject, and what it's quantifying then, of course, is places where you have extreme poverty. And so what we have to do is convert that subject term into places, and then we need to figure out what exactly the quantifier would be. So we end up with something like all places with extreme poverty are places with an increase in crime. And again, notice what this does for us. We have a clear quantifier in standard form, all, no, some are not, in this case all. This is a universal affirmative. We have a clear subject, It is a category of things, places with extreme poverty. We have our copula stuck in between the subject and predicate, and then we get a predicate term, which is itself a class or category of things. So let's look at an example that's a bit more tricky. She is always prepared for class. Now, our knee-jerk reaction here is to look at this and start thinking immediately of singular proposition, so that she has to be translated in something like all persons identical to her are people prepared for class or something like this. And it's not overly surprising that we would at first think that way. But if you really stop and pay attention to this, notice that the always, the adverb here, is actually doing all the quantifying. That's doing the heavy lifting in this particular statement. Because what we're trying to say really is that every moment is one where she's ready. She's always prepared. You can wake her up at 3 in the morning and she's ready for class kind of thing. So she's always prepared. And that means that we have to basically translate our subject term into times or places. So this ends up being the rather weird translation that all times are times when she's prepared for class. I'd stop and think about that one for a bit because it's a bit tricky, but it's important to understand how that would work. Again, the always is actually quantifying the subject term of times. All times are times when she's prepared. Now, what we'll find often when we deal with categorical propositions is that our quantifier is not always going to be expressed in clear terms. In fact, often it's just not given at all. And when you don't have, if you know what your subject term is and you know what your predicate term is, what you need to do basically is just figure out what kind of quantifier it has to be. And of course, notice propositions that have no explicit quantifier are just sorted out by asking the very basic questions that quantifiers are actually trying to sort out. How many of the subject are we dealing with, and what kind of relationship does it have to the predicate? And of course, there are only 4 options, right? We have universal affirmatives, universal negatives, particular affirmatives, and particular negatives. In terms of how many, we just need to know if it's universal or we need to know if it's particular. In terms of what kind, we want to know, are we putting them together? That is it affirmative? Or are we taking them apart? Is it negative? So in the end, if you don't have a clear quantifier, just keep in mind that it has to be one of these 4 things. It will be all, no, some are, or some are not. So let's take a simple example. Beer is made from malted grains. Now it's pretty clear that when we say beer is made from malted grains, that we're talking about all beer, that this is definitional of beer. So our quantifier here is going to be all. All beers are, we need that copula put in there, drinks made from malted grains or beers made from malted grains, doesn't really matter too much. But I need as a predicate also a full subject class. How about diamonds are usually valuable gems? Now there is some room for ambiguity here with the usually. If the usually is doing the quantifying, then it would probably end up being sometimes or times when diamonds are valuable, but that doesn't seem to be what we're trying to get at here. What we're really saying about diamonds and valuable gems is going to be a particular statement and affirmative. So the question you have to ask is, how many of diamonds are we talking about that fit into the class of valuable gems? And what kind of relationship are we talking about? Do I want to say they go together, or are they taken apart? And of course, in this case, it's going to be some are. This is a particular affirmative. Some diamonds are valuable gems. Non-standard quantifiers are actually perhaps the easiest thing to understand as to why it would be a non-standard form of translation. But they're also the ones that tend to trick people. So these are worth paying close attention to. So take this example. All dogs are not cats. Now on the surface, it sure seems like we have everything we want. We have a clear quantifier, all. We have a subject term, dogs, that is itself a category or class of things. We have the copula, are not, and then we have cats, which is also a class or category of things. But of course there's a problem here, and hopefully you recognize it. And the problem can be easiest found by simply looking at our 4 possible forms. Notice, we can only have 4 possible variations on a standard form categorical proposition. All are, no are, some are, and some are not. And the problem, of course, with all dogs are not cats is that it is actually not going to be one of our 4 standard forms. Whenever you have all or not, we need to translate it into a different form. And that form rather clearly is going to be no dogs are cats. So whenever you come across all dogs or all S's are not P's, remember there is no all or not. All or nots become no's, and no or nots would have to become all R's. How about this? Libertarians never win elections. Now this one is also a bit ambiguous. We might take this to mean no times or times when libertarians win elections. And if that's what it does mean, the easiest way to sort that out is to keep looking through the rest of the argument. See how your terms are translated in other premises or the conclusion and so on. Start looking around to see how you translate. But a more plausible take on this is that our quantifier is simply saying no libertarians are. So we end up with something like this. No libertarians are election winners or people who win elections or things like this. Now, conditional statements are going to be very important here. This is something that I pay close attention to, and I promise you'll be tested on this as we go through it. A conditional statement, which is simply an if-then statement, can readily transform into a categorical proposition by following a fairly simple set of rules. Now, conditional statements convert into categorical propositions with the following rules. First, the statement must always be universal. So if I have an if-then claim, if something's a dog, then it's a mammal, I have to convert it into an all or no. The second here is that the antecedent of the conditional statement must be the subject term of your categorical proposition. So notice in standard form, a conditional statement is always going to be if antecedent, then consequent. If we look at the example we saw from the last module, or a couple modules back, the claim, if you wash the car, then I'll pay you $10. The portion of this that sits between the if and the then, you wash the car, is my antecedent, and the part that comes after the then, I will pay you $10, is the consequent. Now notice what the rule says is the antecedent of the conditional statement has to be converted into a subject term. So that follows your quantifier. Let's take the simple example of if something is a dog, then it's a mammal. A very clear conditional statement. Well, note that the antecedent here is going to be something is a dog, and the consequent is simply it is a mammal. And of course, what we have to do to follow the rule is convert this into a universal, and then the antecedent becomes my subject term, and the consequent becomes the predicate term. A reasonable translation then would end up being all dogs are mammals. And notice what this does for us is we take the conditional statement, if something is a dog, then it's a mammal, and it forces this conditional statement to have all the necessary pieces we need for a standard form categorical proposition. I have a quantifier, subject term, copula, predicate term. Let's take another example. A person will succeed if he perseveres. Now notice we do have a conditional statement here, but it is not given to us in standard form. What this means basically is that the antecedent, if you recall, always follows the if in an if-then claim. So really what we have is the antecedent in this case comes at the end and the consequent comes at the beginning. If we were to translate this back into a standard form categorical proposition, what we would get is if he perseveres, then he will succeed. And once we have this, we know what our terms have to be. The antecedent then becomes our subject term, the consequent becomes our predicate term, and we simply need a universal to translate. The result is all people who persevere are people who succeed. One last example of conditional statements. If something is a dog, then it is not a cat. Well, notice what we have here is a nice negative statement in this, and it's pretty clear that when we translate, our universal is going to be negative. Our antecedent, of course, is something is a dog, and our consequent then is actually something is a cat, but we want to make this a negative statement. So our subject term is going to be dog, our predicate term will be cat, and the translation is simply no dogs or cats. So that's the basic rule for how to deal with conditional statements, and I can promise you you'll have to deal with that on the test and elsewhere in the homework, so it's worth paying close attention to it. Perhaps the most confusing of all the translation stuff that you'll have to do for this section deals with what are called exclusive propositions. Exclusive propositions are the kind of propositions where the quantifier is expressed with words or phrases like only X, no one but Fred, none except Bob, and the like. And these frequently lead to confusions, and in particular when you try to identify precisely what your subject is and what the predicate is. The basic rule here is that the predicate term is usually going to follow immediately after the exclusive proposition or indicators. So when I say only Fred, notice Fred immediately follows the only or the exclusive proposition, and that means that Fred is actually not the subject, but rather the predicate. So in a certain sense, you might say this feels like it gets everything backwards. The basic idea is this. If I have something like only Fred did something, or no one but Fred did this, or no job but this one, and so on, what happens is the thing that immediately follows the exclusive proposition gets pushed to the end. So something like only Freds are S's becomes all S's are Fred. Notice how the term that immediately follows my exclusive proposition gets pushed to the end of our categorical proposition. Let's take an example. Only registered students will receive a grade for this class. Well, notice we have an exclusive proposition, only X, and what immediately follows it is registered students. And that means that registered students are in fact the predicate, and they go to the end. Now, the easiest way to deal with these is to frankly just start at the end. Since we know registered student has to be the predicate, just stick it at the end of your claim, and then just start working through the problem backwards. Once we know registered students as our predicate, well, it turns out a copula has to go right behind it. So just stick the copula in and then figure out what your subject term would be as well as your quantifier. And in the end, what we end up with is something like all students who receive a grade are registered students. Another way of putting this, if you want to think about your conditional statements, is basically if you get a grade, then you must have been registered. Take another example. None but a coward dares to boast that he's never known fear. None but is, of course, one of our exclusive propositions, and what immediately follows the none but is coward. So, of course, coward becomes our predicate, which means it has to go at the very end of our categorical proposition. Now, once again, the easiest way to approach these kind of problems is to just start at the end. Since we know cowards are in fact our predicate term, just put that at the end of the statement and then just start working yourself backwards. Of course, what has to go right in front of cowards would be our copula, which is just the verb to be. So put an R in there and then sort out your subject term and figure out which quantifier it's going to be, which is typically a universal. And notice if you think about this, the result is all persons who boast they've never known fear are cowards, which is really just another way of saying if you boast, then you're a coward. Now the last bit here deals with propositions that involve the phrase the only. So when I say the only X or whatever, it's going to follow a very different rule than only X. So propositions where the quantifier is expressed with the only are not exclusive propositions. So they don't follow the rules of all the stuff we just saw before. And that means what immediately follows the only X will typically be your subject term, not the predicate term. So let's take a simple example. The only thing they are car tires. Now notice, the only is not an exclusive proposition, so what immediately follows should be your subject term. And what you end up with is all things that they sell are car tires. Let's try another example. The only thing that interferes with my learning is my education. Now notice, the only here is not only, and it's not an exclusive proposition. So what we do is find the thing that immediately follows the only, and that should be our subject term. So how would this translate? Well, we get all things that interfere with my learning are things identical to my education. So to sum up the difference between the only and our exclusive proposition only, and how they would actually follow in terms of the rule. If you say only X, then whatever X stands for should be the predicate term. In other words, what immediately follows the exclusive proposition should be the predicate of your entire statement. But when I say the only X, X becomes the subject term. So what immediately follows the only is the subject. That's the basic rule between the two. It's actually not that difficult once you get comfortable with it. So you just have to start memorizing these things. And that's pretty much the end of translations. I would strongly encourage you to check this section of your book very carefully, work through it more than once. This is, I think at least, the most challenging portion of everything we're doing in the entire section of categorical reasoning. So let's move on to Chapter 5, Section 5.1 of the book. So in this video, and really in this section of the book, what we're actually doing is moving on to deal with categorical syllogisms. And our primary concern here is how to get a categorical syllogism into standard form. So let's start by defining a categorical syllogism in very clear and explicit terms. A categorical syllogism is a deductive form of argument that consists of precisely 3 categorical propositions in standard form, with the result that there are exactly 3 different terms in the argument as a whole, each of which occurs in exactly 2 of the propositions. To sum this up in terms of what constitutes a standard form categorical syllogism, what we find is the following. First, in standard form, every single proposition in the argument must be a standard form categorical proposition that fits exactly one of the 4 forms that we've talked about, A, E, I, or O. That is, I need a universal affirmative, a universal negative, a particular affirmative, or a particular negative. All are, no are, some are not will begin every single proposition in the argument. So notice what we're talking about here. A standard form categorical proposition has a quantifier, a subject term, a copula, and a predicate term in that order every time without fail. Second, in standard form, a categorical syllogism will always have a single conclusion that is drawn from 2 premises. Now notice that single conclusion and both premises are standard form categorical propositions, but you will always have 1 conclusion, 2 premises in a standard form categorical syllogism. Now, I've mentioned this before, but it's worth restating. You can have categorical reasoning, and in fact syllogistic reasoning, that is more complicated than this. But what that really means is you have multiple and different categorical syllogisms working together. A single categorical syllogism always has 1 conclusion and 2 premises. So to give you an example of what one might look like in standard form without any actual content, notice I have 2 premises there and 1 conclusion. In each statement, both premises and the conclusion, I have a standard form categorical proposition. All P's or M's is simply a universal, affirmative, quantifier, subject term, copula, predicate term. My second premise is all M's or S, again, quantifier, subject term, copula, predicate term, and my conclusion is much the same, all S's or P's. So what we have are 2 premises, 1 conclusion, and we know that every single statement in there is a standard form categorical proposition. And of course, the last point that needs to be mentioned is that once it's in standard form, you will find that the argument as a whole, that is both premises and the conclusion, will have exactly 3 different terms in it, and each term will repeat itself twice in the argument as a whole. So if you look at the example we just saw, notice how I have 2 different P terms, I have 2 different M terms, and 2 different S terms in this particular instance. Each term shows up twice, it repeats itself. It is this repetition that makes the argument work. Now, some basic terminology you need to get very comfortable with. This stuff is about being organized. You need to understand these concepts in order to get the argument into standard form. So we need to define our major terms, our minor terms, and our middle terms. The easiest way to do this is to take an example of an argument in standard form. So we have noticed 2 premises, 1 conclusion. Everything you see here is a standard form categorical proposition. Now, the major term of your syllogism is going to be the thing that shows up as the predicate of the conclusion. Notice what this means. If we go just to the conclusion all by itself, we know it's a standard form categorical proposition, which means it has a quantifier, it has its own subject term, it has its copula, and it has its predicate term. To determine what the major term is in the argument as a whole, just go find that predicate term, which in this case is beings that will die. And again, notice the major term is whatever occurs here as the predicate term of the conclusion. And that means the major term is beings that will die. It is also called the major term in the first premise that shares it. The minor term is whatever occurs as the subject of the conclusion. And just like before, it will be the minor term in the premise that shares that term. In this case, human beings is our minor term. And the middle term is whatever shows up in both premises. So notice in this case we have mortals. It shows up in the first premise and it shows up in the second premise. So we can now distinguish between what we call the major premise and the minor premise by simply looking to see where those particular terms are. The major premise is the one that has the major term in it. And remember, the major term is beings that will die because that's the predicate of the conclusion, and it shows up in this case on the first line. The minor term is human beings, and that shows up as the subject of our conclusion, which means that the second premise, the one that sits in the middle there, is our minor premise. In standard form, this is very important, an argument must always have the major premise first, the minor premise second, and the conclusion on the bottom. So let me repeat this because it's quite important. In standard form, a categorical syllogism will always have its major premise as the first premise on the top, the minor premise as the second premise in the middle, and then the conclusion on the bottom. Again, major premise, minor premise, conclusion in that order is standard form. And of course, how you determine the major and minor premise is by simply looking at your conclusion and determining what the subject is and what the predicate is. The predicate is your major term, the subject is your minor term. So if that makes sense, we can move on to talk about the mood and figure of a standard form categorical syllogism. Now this is really just a kind of convenient tool for being organized, for recognizing different standard kind of common forms of categorical syllogisms. It's an old tradition, we're going to use it. The basic idea is this. So the mood of an argument is very simple to figure out, and it's probably easiest by jumping straight into an example. Take a look at this particular argument. No P's are M's, some M's are S's, therefore some S's are not P's. The first thing to note about this is that it is in standard form. Notice my minor term is S, and so the minor premise is the one that contains S, and it's sitting in the middle. The major term is P, which comes at the end of my conclusion. The major premise, therefore, is the one that contains P in it. It's on top, so I have in proper order, major premise, minor premise, conclusion in order. The mood of an argument is simply determined by looking at your quantifier for each statement, both premises and the conclusion. And what you do is simply assign to it the letter designation that goes with that specific quantifier. So notice no claims are E claims, some claims are I claims, and some are not claims or O claims. And so the mood of this argument would simply be EIO. And notice that the mood is listed in order of the major premise, minor premise, and conclusion. So EIO is essentially the mood of this argument. The major premise is an E claim, that is a universal negative. The minor premise is an I claim, a particular affirmative, and the conclusion is an O claim, a particular negative. Let's take a look at another example. In this case, we have all P's are M's, all S's are M's, therefore all S's are P's. The first thing to note about this, like with the first one, is that everything here is given to you in standard form. My major premise is the first line, my minor premise comes second, and the conclusion is on the bottom. And of course, the mood of this then would simply be AAA, because each one of the statements, both premises and the conclusion, are given to you as a universal affirmative, and these are A claims. So notice the AAA is listing in order major premise, minor premise, in conclusion. That is the mood of this particular argument. Now there are 64 possible moods if you stop and think about how this could work. I could have, for example, AAA, AAE, AEI, AEO, and so on, and I could just keep going and there'd be 64 possible variations on this theme. So we've figured out how to solve for the mood of an argument, and the next thing to do is talk about its figure. The figure is determined by the location of the middle terms in any categorical syllogism. And it turns out, if you think about it, that there are only 4 possible places that the middle term could show up. In each case, a middle term has to show up in both premises. So there should be one middle term in the major premise and one middle term in the minor premise. And as a result of this, what we find is that there are only 4 possible ways in which you could have this. So figure 1, we give them numbers. Figure 1 is where in the major premise, the middle term is the subject of that statement, and in the minor premise, it's the predicate. Figure 2, the middle term is the predicate in both the major and the minor terms. Figure 3, the middle term is the subject in both the major and the minor. And then in figure 4, what we find is in the major premise, the predicate is your middle term, and in the minor premise, the subject is your middle term. Now, frankly, there's nothing to do for this except to memorize how this works by, simply running through these numbers, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Hurley proposes that you can kind of memorize this by thinking about it like it's a button-up shirt collar, where notice 1 is diagonal, moving from the top to the bottom diagonally. Number 2 goes straight up on the outside. Number 3 is straight up on the inside, and number 4 is diagonally in the other direction of 1. However you do it, you need to simply memorize the figure of an argument by looking at these 4 possibilities. Now, mood and figure, if we put this together, there were 64 possible moods and there are 4 possible figures, which means there are 256 possible forms of a standard form categorical syllogism. Now, it turns out that in the vast majority of cases, these are going to be invalid. So let's look at a few examples here just to run through and sort of solve for the question of mood and figure. So here's an argument given to you in standard form. All P's are M's, some S's are M's, and some S's are P's. Now, if you stop and think about this, the mood is fairly simple. My major premise is an A claim, my minor premise is an I claim, and my conclusion is also an I claim, a particular affirmative. So the mood of this argument is simply AII. And of course, the figure is determined by looking at the middle term. And in this case, notice the middle term is sitting on the outside of both of my premises. It stands as the predicate of the major and the minor premise, and that is figure 2. So the mood and figure of this is simply AII2. So let's walk through a few examples and then we can put an end to this video. Now in this particular example, the argument has not been laid out for you already in its standard form. And instead what we have is an argument where there's actually language filling in for the various terms, our subject and predicate, or major, minor, and middle terms. Now this argument says no nuclear-powered submarines are commercial vessels. All nuclear-powered submarines are warships, therefore no warships are commercial vessels. Now, frankly, when you're taking an argument in ordinary language and you want to convert it into standard form, the first thing you need to do, if you can, is figure out what your conclusion is. Because once you know the conclusion, you also know what your major and your minor terms are, and that will determine where your premises go. So my conclusion is rather clearly identified by a nice therefore, and the conclusion then is no warships or commercial vessels. Now, starting with the conclusion is very useful because now we know exactly what our minor term is and what our major term is. The minor term here is warship, the major term is commercial vessel. And that means that C has to go into the major premise on top, and W has to go into the minor premise in the middle. So to finish this out, we end up with no N's or C's as our major premise, all N's or W's as our minor premise, and our conclusion is no W's or C's. And then if we want to sort out the mood of the argument, that's pretty simple. In order from major premise, minor premise to conclusion, we get EAE. And of course, the middle term, the in here, is sitting both on the inside of my premises as the subject term of each line. And what that means basically is that we're talking about the figure 3. So this argument, when all is said and done, is an EAE3. Let's take a look at another example. No television stars are certified public accountants, but all certified public accountants are people of good business sense. It follows that no television stars are people of good business sense. Once again, it's best to start if you can with your conclusion, simply because this will help you identify your major and minor terms. And in this case, we have a very clear indication of our conclusion with it follows that, and our conclusion is obviously no television stars are people of good business sense. So we want to put this on the bottom, and now we know television stars is our minor term and our major term is people of good business sense. And then we want to sort out our major and minor premise accordingly. Notice that the major term needs to go first for it to be in standard form, and the minor term, in this case t, needs to go in the middle as the second premise for it to be the minor premise. And of course, from this point, it's pretty simple to figure out what your mood and figure is. Notice my major premise is an all claim, which is simply an A. My minor premise is a no claim, which is an E claim, and my conclusion is also another E claim. So my mood of this particular argument is AEE. And then we just want to go look for our middle term. And notice our middle term here is the letter C, which shows up in the major premise as the subject and the minor premise as the predicate of that particular statement. So it's moving diagonally from the top to the bottom. This is our number 1 in terms of the figure. So this argument then, the mood and figure, is simply AEE1. Let's take one last example, and then we'll be done with this particular section of the course. Some conservatives are not advocates of high tariff rates because all advocates of high tariff rates are Republicans, and some Republicans are not conservatives. Now, the first thing to note here, of course, is that our conclusion shows up right in the beginning, and our premises follow this. Everything after because is a premise. So we need to start with the conclusion if we can, and then write that down in standard form, getting rid of content, substituting letters for, in this case, conservative, and then the other side, advocates of high tariff rates. So what do we get? Well, we get some C's are not A's. Our minor term now is C, or conservatives. Our major term here is A, which is advocates, and this will help us sort out where our major premise goes and where our minor premise goes. So our major premise goes on top, all A's are R. Our minor premise, which contains the minor term C in it, is some R's are not C. And then the mood and figure is fairly simple to sort out. The major premise is a universal affirmative. That gets the letter designation A. The minor premise is a particular negative, which gets the letter designation O. And our conclusion, likewise, is a particular negative, which also gets the letter O. So the mood of this argument, in order from major premise, minor premise to conclusion, is simply AOO. And then we need to figure out the figure of the argument by going and finding our middle terms. Now notice the middle term in this case is the letter R, and the letter R in the major premise is on the outside as the predicate of that statement, but in the minor it's the subject term on the inside. So it's moving diagonally in this direction, which makes it the number 4 for its figure. And so the mood and figure of this original argument is simply AOO4. Now hopefully all of this makes sense. A lot of this is kind of just the bureaucratic nuts and bolts of getting arguments into standard form. It is unfortunately tedious, but it's also very important that you understand it and that you know how to do it. So I'd suggest practicing with this stuff a bunch, and in particular with translations, which I think can be very difficult. So if you have any questions about this, please let me know, or post something on the discussion board and I'll happily discuss it with you. From here, we're going to move on to the first step in proving validity in a categorical syllogism, and we'll do so with Venn diagrams. There'll be a second video for this.